Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Kelsey Woodworth, the Senior Marketing Manager here at Smartling, and I'm joined today by Alex Yanishevsky, our Director of AI and Machine Translation, and Andrew Batwash, our Associate Director of Language Services. So thank you guys for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so today we are going to discuss the myths and realities around AI in the entertainment space. So as we usually do in these sessions, it's going to be fireside chat discussion. We're going to go through a couple of myths and then the realities that are accompanied by them. And as I mentioned in the chat, if you do have questions throughout today's session, please drop them in the Q&A tab and we will address them at the end. So let's go ahead and get things started. So Alex, before we dive into today's myths, just to give everyone a lay of the land, could you just go ahead and define AI for us?
Yeah, sure. So I know we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about different technologies, right, that ultimately fall into this AI umbrella. So I wanted to make sure that we kind of have a common baseline when we're talking about this, right? Because there's a lot of different definitions that people use for AI, right? And you'll see, for example, even like very naive statements like, "Hey, let's have AI do all of this sort of stuff," right? So I wanted to make sure that we have like this, common baseline, right? And also to delineate different use cases. So I find that McKinsey Consulting has a really good definition that's, in my mind, is fairly all-encompassing. So basically, AI, or artificial intelligence, is a machine's ability to perform cognitive functions that we usually associate with a human brain, right, with human minds. So things like perceiving, reasoning, learning, right? Researchers actually talk about different types of AI, and there are three kind of main different types. So one is artificial narrow intelligence. So that's AI that's designed to complete a very specific action. It's unable to learn independently, right? So when you think about things like Google Translate, like Siri, that's really what we're talking about. That's going to be the basis of our conversation here. Then there's the idea of artificial general intelligence, where the AI is designed to learn to think and perform at similar levels to humans. And the last one is artificial superintelligence, where AI is able to surpass the knowledge and capabilities of humans. I think that's kind of the North Star. I think a lot of researchers will admit that even though this is something that seems very daunting for us as human beings, we're quite a bit off from that, right? In our conversation today, we're really going to talk about artificial narrow intelligence doing the specific task, right? In our case, it's going to be, how do we get output in another language for the entertainment industry, for very, very creative content, right? So previously, we talk about machine translation, which is a subset of AI. So I'm talking about things like Google Translate, Microsoft Bing, or transcreation, a human being writing from scratch, right? What's changed the landscape a lot is the popularity and the viability of large language models, LLMs, right? So when you think of the GPT family, ChatGPT, GPT-4, Google Bard, Anthropic's Claude 1 and 2, etc., right? We can accomplish this task of getting an output into another language in a bunch of different ways, right? So we can talk about using a generic machine translation, right, from a Google Translate, Microsoft, etc. We could train those engines to get better outputs. And now here's where large language models kind of enter the fray. We could use large language models as an empty provider, right? So for example, in our platform, we have the ability to request that translation to come from an LLM, the GPT family, rather than just neural machine translation like Google Translate. We could use LLMs as a smoothing mechanism, right? So we can go ahead and get output from Microsoft, Google, DeepL, etc., Amazon, and smooth that output in a particular way. And lastly, we can use these large language models for transcreation with post-editing, right? So basically, rather than starting from a blank template, we start with something and a human being can edit that and be more productive, right? So essentially, I want to kind of end this thought with, I think are in a very exciting place, right? So rather than having just one AI tool, which is the current generation of neural machine translation, we have numerous tools at our disposal. And what's even more exciting, I think, is a myriad of use cases. So we can benchmark things against each other. We can combine them with each other. We have lots of ability to hedge our bets and diversify, right? So we can, and Andrew's going to talk about this from the production side, but we can do really, really useful things like maybe one locale pair is better, or one content type is better for the current generation of NMTs. Maybe in another one, we use smoothing. Maybe a third one is better with LLMs as an MT provider, right? So we can go ahead and mix and match things. And then lastly, when we think about higher creativity or emotional engagement, we can even use these LLMs as a transcreation partner and then edit on top of them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. And that's a great place to get us started for today. And one other thing I want to touch on before we get into our myths for the day is, we can't talk about AI in entertainment without mentioning what's going on right now with the news around the strikes with the Writers Guild of America and the SAG Association or SAG-AFTRA as well. So, Andrew, what do we know about the strikes that are going on in Hollywood, and where does AI fit in here?
Yeah, I think like it's fair to say there's been a lot of disruption in the media and entertainment space, right? Especially the last 10 years. Streaming, competition with like other platforms, social media platforms like TikTok and Facebook for consumer attention. And certainly like even COVID disrupted, right? Like people's viewing habits, right? And what they consume. So without getting into the details of like, what each side is looking for, and it's there's been a lot of kind of like changes in that dynamic. It's fair to say like AI is coming in behind all of that disruption and really like touching a nerve, right? But really what it's also doing, it's highlighting kind of like the fear and the optimism on both sides, right? Of kind of this new technology that is not just kind of limited to the dispute between the Screen Actors Guild and kind of the entertainment companies. Alex mentioned a bunch of these possible applications, and that's causing like I said, some fear, but also some optimism, right? There's definitely some room in the entertainment space to leverage AI. There are people that certainly think that AI will never be as good as what like creative folks are doing today, right? It'll take something away, right? And then there are also people that think AI will take over everything, and it'll allow, content to reach new audiences. It'll bring costs down. It'll have all these other benefits. It's probably going to be somewhere in the middle, right? And I think what happens in the entertainment industry is really going to be informative, but I also think it's really going to illustrate how a lot of other domains kind of grapple with this problem. And I think like this dynamic is really going to help us like have a conversation about at least looking at the AI problem through this dynamic is really going to help us have a conversation about some of the assumptions and some of the fear and optimism on both sides.
Yeah, thank you. And so now let's jump over to myth number one, because I think exactly what you just said, Andrew, there's fear and there's optimisms on both sides of that argument, and across all other industries. So with myth number one today being, let me share the slide, that AI is suitable for more straightforward content like online documentation, but it is not suitable for streaming and entertainment content. So Alex, over to you to bust myth number one.
Yeah, so if you can, Kelsey, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. Yeah, so when we're talking about the question of content being suitable for machine translation, right? I personally find it helpful to think in terms of two continuums, and you kind of see them plotted here as a matrix. So the idea of content types and the idea of linguistic complexity, right? So what I mean by linguistic complexity is some languages are more complicated than others just by their sheer by their native grammatical nature, by their grammatical structure, right? So what we found is that most languages, except for very, very rare languages or low resource languages for which we don't have a lot of data, they've already shown themselves to be quite productive with machine translation post editing with the current state of technology as it is, with generic NMT engines. And they're even better when we train engines, especially when we take data, we curate it, we find that their productivity is a lot better. And that's something that can be measured using textual and semantic auto scoring. Now, when we're talking about large language models like the GPT family, like GPT-4, the latest one, like Google Palm, they look very, very promising. And we'll kind of cover that a bit more later. As far as languages themselves, the tendency that we see is Romance languages and Nordic languages will generally outperform the mid-tier languages like German and Slavic languages, or the more difficult languages like Asian languages. And this tends to be true both on the NMT side, the current engines, as well as the LLM side, right? But even with these mid-complexity and high-complexity languages like German, Slavic, Asian languages, even more difficult agglutinative languages like Finnish, for example, we still find that they're eminently suitable for machine translation, but perhaps with less productivity. So in other words, yes, you can use Hungarian. Yes, you can use Estonian for machine translation. You could use Hebrew, Arabic. Just don't expect them to perform as well as Spanish or Portuguese, right? Now, as far as content types, and this is, I think, important for the entertainment industry, content is not homogeneous. There isn't only one type of content. If you think about an enterprise in the entertainment industry, be it EA, be it Netflix, be it Disney, you're going to have a bunch of different content. You're going to have more straightforward content that relate to online documentation, like technical support tickets, knowledge bases, forums, etc. Right? This is kind of the bread and butter of MTP productivity. And the truth is, even if you're Netflix, as much as you might need to have a description of a plot for a series, you're still going to need to handle support tickets about passwords not working. Right? So there are things that work better. Right. So, for example, for more creative content, sure, it may not be as productive as machine translation post editing, but there are definitely gains to be had from it. And some proof that we see is client companies like EA or Disney that actually use MT and have spoken about it in industry conferences. And another thing that's, to me, very telling and evidence of the fact that MT works here is that we actually see providers that have trained MT engines specifically for the video game space, like ModelWiz, right? And lastly, what I want to mention here is that generative AI, right? So the ability to produce a localized content based on a good prompt with subsequent post editing really shows a lot of promise too, and will continue to improve.
Yeah, and Alex, I think that's exactly right. And we see examples within our existing customers today who are in the entertainment space, thinking about how to navigate these very considerations. And I think we could use the entertainment space categorization pretty broadly, right? Because there are traditional like media and entertainment companies, but there are also streaming platforms like you mentioned, gaming companies and even social media companies, right? That are really kind of like generating content to just engage with users, right? Engage with consumers. And a lot of these customers do use traditional workflows, kind of like the two-pass human workflow. But we're still, we're starting to see more and more take that nuanced approach and look for a viable entry point where they can apply an AI solution, gain in efficiency, right? And you might not like today see, like a chat GPT generated, translation on screen in like a Hollywood voiceover, right? Or something like that. But, we are seeing opportunities where customers are leveraging, AI in like, the transcription process, right? To generate those efficiencies in that workflow where it makes sense, while still also allowing kind of the humans in those workflows to add value where it makes sense still, right? And so it's really about finding that entry point and supplementing. And so we already see customers where, like I mentioned, human voiceover content is going to a human for voiceover is really being generated by like an AI solution in the transcription process, right? And depending on kind of like the customer's preferences, they may do some post editing of that, they may not, right? And so those kinds of customers who are blending these solutions really well, they're going to see an increase in time to market. They're going to see reduced costs, right? They're going to be able to manage their quality in a pretty sophisticated way, and that's a huge advantage today, right? And another entry point is obviously social media content, right? There's a lot of user generated content there. There's even content metadata, right? And maybe you wouldn't traditionally think of this space as entertainment. Like I said before, the TikToks of the world and the Facebooks are competing with, companies that are producing, television shows and movies and even gaming platforms just the same for our attention. And a lot of that content is very suitable for AI-based solutions, right? These things are really produced, or this type of content is really like high volume, is quick release cycles, right? And it's critical for these companies, right, to get engagement, right? So using an AI solution here can be cost effective, and it can help sustain growth, especially kind of in the business environment that we're in now, where costs are a huge consideration. We're working right now with a social media company that has a ton of user-generated content. It is a mountain of content, right? And it would be like cost prohibitive to kind of localize this in any other way but an MT or AI-based solution. So, they're having success there with that. And the last thing I'll say on this is, I think like in general, the perception of like AI and machine translation has evolved quite a bit, even in the last few years. And I think, the perception, and, Alex, you hinted at this to start, the perception is probably lagging a little bit in the entertainment space, where there is a lot more creative type content, right? But as these customers kind of engage with machine translation solutions and find these viable entry points, I think we're going to see that perception start to change, right? And obviously the technology is going to evolve as well. One of the things that's a little bit limiting right now, and Alex, you're talking about how these tools kind of integrate with like an enterprise solution. It's really hard unless you can build those solutions yourself to kind of like scale and build the automation and incorporate these LLMs and these AI solutions, right? And I think that's something that SmartLink is really like well positioned to do, so that a customer in the entertainment space can look at their workflows, look at their content types, look at their language groups and say, hey, I want to apply this AI solution here because we know it'll realize value for us in this use case. And in this other use case, we're going to leverage a different kind of solution, right? And that doesn't really exist out there in the market, but that's something that SmartLink is really able to provide customers, in particular in this kind of space where they really need to be differentiated in a very sophisticated way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. And now let's look at the flip side of the coin for myth number 2, which is let's just AI everything. So a more extreme standpoint. But back over to you, Andrew, on what you think about this.
Well, Kelsey, I think companies are seeing, they're looking around, they're seeing the possibilities, right? I think like collectively, everybody was pretty astounded, when GPT-3 and GPT-4 came out, right? And companies, looked at that and said, hey, there's a lot here that we can tap into. For example, this is not directly related to the entertainment industry, but IBM looked at that and said, hey, like there's a lot of work that we're doing in IBM that could be automated using these kinds of tools, right? And they expressed a goal. I think their CEO came out earlier in the year and said, we want to reduce our workforce by 7% over the next few years through kind of like internal efficiency based on these AI tools. So there's like a little bit of a gold rush mindset right now. And I think companies are trying to be like the first mover in this space and try to, get ahead of their competition, bring costs down, reach new audiences, and still maintain, these like fluent high quality translations. This really kind of effective way of engaging with their customers and their users.
Definitely. And Alex, a question for you. So what are the consequence or considerations and nuances that people should be aware of when they have that impulse to AI everything?
Yeah, so as Andrew said, and if you can go to the next slide, right? As Andrew said, a little bit, I'm gonna be kind of a wet blanket here, right? But hopefully it put some kind of pragmatism, some guardrails around this, right? Because on the other hand, right, we can say let's just send everything to AI. It doesn't matter whether it's large language models or current generation of NMT models. Let's just send everything there, right? And I think the answer is a lot more complicated, and I want to kind of unpack what can and can't be done, right? So the reason it's a very complicated answer is you have to consider nuances like content types, file types, markup like tags, variables, placeholders. Andrew alluded to this as well, workflows that now include both translation memory and machine translation, right? And that machine translation now is coming from a couple of different places, right? Not only your Google, Amazon, Microsoft, DeepL, etc., but coming from the family of GPT, from Google Palm, right? And in addition to that, how does it get in to the system in the first place to go to that MT as a provider, right? So you need a content management system, or you need some authoring system, right? You basically need some sort of integration or connectors. So in essence, what we're talking about right now is really an enterprise grade production platform that has all of that, right? That can on a dime say, hey, I have this content from this CMS, it hits this translation memory, uses this MT as a provider, and has this dynamic workflow. That's really, really complicated to start out with, right? And there aren't many companies who are well positioned to do that, right? In addition to that, right, once, let's say, the content gets into the system, there's a couple of other things to consider. So when we're dealing, just a couple of examples for you that are very, very typical for the entertainment industry, right? You'll typically have subtitles that come in an SRT file, and you'll have a timestamp as you see here on the screen. But the issue is they'll tend to be fragments of a sentence, right? You'll have a timestamp with part of a sentence, then another timestamp with another part of a sentence. Now, we as human beings can deal with that. Machines can't. If you send the machine part of a sentence, it's going to get very, very confused, right? So at best, it's going to give you some output. At worst, it's going to not give you an output at all. But chances are the output that'll give you, it's not going to be very good, to put it tactfully, right? So what's the key here, right? What we want to do is we want to merge all of this into one sentence that's coherent and pre-process it and send it over to the LLM or to MT, right? But then there's another trick, which is great. You got your machine translation, it's good now, but that's not the way the customer wants it. You can't return it that way. It's going to break things. So now you need to split it back, right? So these are all complicated things that a platform needs to do. Another example is dealing with placeholders, right? What you'll see here, this is actually an example from EA. You have the value, you have the placeholder value, right? The variable value. If that gets translated into whatever language, in this case it's Italian, it's valore, right? And if you leave it as is, this over translation will just completely break the software, right? So you need to have the wherewithal to have directives in your platform that allow for these sorts of technical nuances to be taken care of, right? And you need to make sure that you also can have these dynamic workflows that are based on specific file types and content types, right? So that's a really, really important consideration why you can't just willy-nilly send everything to machine translation or to AI. Another thing that, and I said I was going to be a wet blanket, so apologies. Another thing that I want to be transparent about is what works and doesn't work with LLMs. They're very, very promising, right? But the analogy that I like to use is you might have a brilliant 8-year-old. That doesn't mean that you give them the keys to your car and let them start driving around town, right? And that's what we're seeing from LLMs. I bet like some of you have played around this, see this yourself too. They're extremely brilliant, yet at the same time, they're extremely unpredictable, right? So you'll get performance issues, you'll exceed quotas, timeouts, you'll get empty quality issues, right? You'll get hallucinations, missed lines, repeated lines. Just the other day, I sent a translation. I asked an LLM for a translation. Not only did it not give me a translation, it repeated the same English sentence 77 times, right? So like that's all good and fine when you're doing experiments, but what do you do in production, right? So these are the sorts of things that we're thinking about on a platform level. How do we mitigate this risk, right? How do we look into solutions like, okay, this doesn't work. We need to go to a fallback engine, right? It hallucinated, it missed a line. Let's go to a fallback engine. Or it gave us an output, but this output doesn't make sense. Why put the burden on the human being? Can we do quality estimation, figure out that this is not good and somehow flag it for the human being, or conversely send it to a fallback engine, right? So there are lots of guardrails we need to put in place just so we're not blindly AIing everything.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Alex. I think I think there's a lot of discussion, and businesses are certainly thinking about these things, but I don't think we're at the point where these considerations have really been internalized from like a workflow requirement, even like a team and organizational perspective within companies. Like right now, when like a human translator works on like a machine translation, machine generated output, it's essentially a linguistic task, right? Like they're making it more natural sounding. They're correcting, grammatical errors and punctuation errors and things like that. But in the future, you might not need that linguistic task, right? Like one of the things that these LLMs are so great at is being like fluent and conversational, right? Like no surprise. But they do have these other sorts of problems that you mentioned, the hallucinations, kind of introductions and omissions of new data, so to speak. And so you may need different kinds of skills and different kinds of workflows to work with an output like that. And certainly in some industries, in the entertainment industry, for example, how do you control for things like copyright infringement, right? Like, that's something that you're going to have to consider if you're going to use these solutions. And so then if you're integrating kind of like a human into that sort of workflow to do some sort of review or post editing, you really need to think about like what that human needs to be adept at doing in this kind of world. And so maybe somebody who is adept at reviewing variables or placeholders in the content, as opposed to making linguistic corrections. So again, like we mentioned this a couple times, but this is really kind of the advantage of a tool like SmartLink, because it does give you the ability to integrate all of these solutions and the options to manage those solutions and kind of direct them in the ways that you need to direct them, right? And so if you do need to have a certain solution for a certain content type, if you do need to have a post editor or even a validator in the workflow, right? This is something that SmartLink can do. We're kind of an A to Z solution. So as companies think about how to bring AI to bear in their workflows, finding that viable entry point that we talked about. Alex, the considerations that you mentioned around language groups, content types, right? What kind of workflows can you put together? Based on that, SmartLink is really a tool that allows companies to have that level of nuance and to really think about, where the AI solution makes sense, where the human, traditional workflow solution makes sense, and how to kind of execute that in a way that's automated and at scale.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that, Andrew. We had a question come in from Diana that I think, kind of ties in directly to this, which she asks: are there currently flags to alert a human when but maybe she meant LLMs go awry? So do we have anything in place to kind of flag when something looks off from the AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna kick it over to Alex, because this is probably a little bit more of a technical question. But I do think like one thing to think about here is when you say go awry, if you're using content generated by, like an OpenAI large language model, or Google's LLM, or what have you, go awry means something maybe a little bit different in those cases than if you're using content generated from like a neural machine translation engine. And I don't know, Alex, you want to kind of get into more detail on that or not? But
yes, so there are. It's a great question, because we see things go less awry and less wrong in the current generation, in the current NMT engines. It happens more on large language models, right? And there are different ways things can go awry, right? Ranging from, if you start out with a prompt to generate content where either at its worst, right, the content could be culturally biased, could have obscenities in it, right? And there is a way to catch that. At its best, you'll get a translation, but the translation won't make any sense. And then you could have things in between where there'll be lines absolutely that are missing or that are repeated. Some of the things that we're working on is, how do we basically, what's the decision mechanism, right? Do we just warn the user that something went wrong, or do we go a little bit further and actually make a decision for the user and say, we know this went wrong, we're going to send it to a fallback engine, right? So basically what I want to get at is, the technology exists. The technology is not perfect by any means, but the technology exists for us to try to identify when things go a little bit awry. It's more a question of how we present that to the user, right? Whether we make the decision for the user and say, oh, look, it's wrong, we're going to go to a fallback engine, or we're going to give you a warning, you should just be aware of it as you begin to post edit. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. I think this kind of ties into, you touched on some of this, Alex, but there's another question. Can you train LLMs? And so this is perfect. Let's just roll into Q&A. So if you have questions, drop them in the tab.
Yeah, so this is going to be somewhat of a lengthy answer, because there are lots of ifs and thens. So short answer, yes, you can train LLMs. Long answer, it depends. So what I mean by that is, ChatGPT and GPT-4 cannot be trained at the present moment. The only thing that you can train is GPT-3 DaVinci in the OpenAI family. That's going to be deprecated soon. So I think in the next 5-6 months, we'll see things changing there, right? We can train GPT-3 DaVinci, we can train PaLM. And then there's also the question, when we say train an LLM, what do we mean, right? There is a full training or fine tuning in the way that we would do on top of a Google or Microsoft, right? Where you take your translation memories, ideally you highly curate them to get rid of all of the noise, and you train a GPT-3 or a PaLM, right? That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is this idea of few shot examples, which is basically, you give examples to the model in your prompt, right? So if you think about, like, let's say you want to you want the model to tell you whether a review for a particular film is good or bad or neutral. You give it examples of what it's considered good or bad and neutral in the prompt, right? Like, this movie is good, this is a positive review, this movie is awful, this is a negative review. And then the model will learn from that and hopefully give you the correct output for the specific sentence that you're asking, right? So that's a few shot example. So yes, they can be either fine-tuned, or you can do few shot examples. One last thing I want to say on the subject is, the thing that we're looking into that shows to be very, very promising, and we actually have some patent pending technology on it, is doing post editing, which is let the NMT engine give you the output, and then go use the LLM for smoothing it, for normalizing it, for things like formality, gender, glossary, tone of voice.
Right. And this is actually kind of related to the previous question in some ways, right? A lot of these, I think a lot of the optimism around this is for companies to use their own data, right? And kind of inform, the output from these large language models, right? And so like a very basic example would be like if I have a help center like chatbot, support kind of thing, it's going to know my documentation, it's going to know my, brand voice, it's going to know kind of my business rules, all that kind of stuff, right? And it's going to talk to my customers using that data. And that, really doing that is really kind of one way to think about like how to keep these large language models from going awry, right? At the moment, though, as Alex mentioned, like that's not really like a viable solution in the marketplace, right? And we're not kind of there yet. And so there's some level of either, automated post editing or human post editing or something that you're going to have to do as an enterprise to deploy these kinds of solutions at scale today. So we're not quite there yet, but that is coming, I think, pretty soon.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, we have yet to try much with AI. Where do you recommend starting that is relatively low risk?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the kind of content. If you have content, this is very similar maybe to the Alex, the conversation that we have with customers about leveraging machine translation, right? If you have content that is really high volume, right? That would have a high cost to localize, but maybe you're not like investing a large amount of money on kind of the creation and publication and maintenance of that content. So like, a help center, for example, would be the good example of that. That would be a good opportunity to start. And if you have, for example, like user generated content, if you're, have user reviews, user posts, things like that, where again, the volumes are really high and maybe the most important thing is that a reader can access that or a user can access that in their native language. And if you could do that at a low cost, that would be a good entry point. You can layer on top of that, all the other considerations that we've talked about here, the content types itself, right? The language groups and all those kinds of things. But in terms of just getting like pointed in the direction, I think like that would be how I would look at it and what I would recommend if a customer was talking about it. I would certainly shy away from, content that you're looking to make a high impact on your business, that is going to drive engagement numbers, drive conversion numbers, drive sales, whatever kind of measurables you're looking at. So that's kind of how I would approach it.
Great, thank you. So I think that is all that we have time for today. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I will drop the link in the chat to our next webinar that is coming up on September 13th with our partners at Dispatch. They are an email template platform, and they offer a localization integration with SmartLing. So we're going to be discussing how to navigate change and maintain continuity in your localization strategy despite all of the external factors and the economy and things that are happening right now. So despite the turbulence in the world, how you can keep your strategy smooth and moving forward. So we hope to see you there. And thank you again for joining us today. And as always, if you have any questions, you can just reach out to us at any time and we'll get back to you. So thank you for joining today and see you later.
Thank you.